The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, thick with the weight of assumptions. Judge Alan Whitmore leaned back in his chair, peering down at Marcus Carter, a 19-year-old standing at the defendant's table, alone, hands in his pockets, unfazed. "You think this is a debate club, kid?" Whitmore scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. Laughter rippled through the room. But Marcus didn't flinch. He just smirked, because the judge had already made his first mistake. Comment where you're watching from, like, share, and subscribe. The air inside the New York State Superior Court was thick with anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, murmuring among themselves as they waited for the hearing to begin. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of routine, but no one in that room was prepared for what was about to unfold. At the defendant's table stood Marcus Carter, a 19-year-old accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. He had no lawyer at his side, only his hands casually tucked into his pockets and a quiet confidence in his stance. His dark eyes scanned the room, his expression unreadable, giving away nothing. From his elevated seat, Judge Alan Whitmore, a man in his late 60s with thinning gray hair and an air of self-importance, peered down at Marcus over the rim of his glasses. The way he looked at the young man made it clear that the real trial had little to do with the law. It was about something else, something unspoken but deeply ingrained. Leaning back in his chair, Judge Whitmore smirked. "You think you're some kind of legal expert," he mused, amusement dripping from his voice. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff. The stenographer. Even Prosecutor Richard Callahan, a man whose suits were always impeccably pressed and whose record boasted an overwhelming number of convictions, allowed himself a small smirk. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't laugh. For years, he had prepared for this moment, not this exact one, of course. He had never planned to stand in a courtroom as a defendant. But he knew this space, the rhythm of trials, the games prosecutors played. While other kids spent their time memorizing football stats, Marcus had been studying case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head. His mother, Regina Carter, had worked as a legal researcher for nearly 20 years, and Marcus had grown up listening to the stories she brought home, stories about how the justice system wasn't always about justice. Judge Whitmore sighed, flipping open the case file in front of him. "Let's make this quick," he muttered. "I have a lunch reservation at 1. Laughter filled the courtroom again, but this time, it was different. This time, Marcus allowed the faintest smirk to curl at the edge of his lips. Because Judge Whitmore had just made his first mistake. And no one else in the courtroom had noticed. The murmurs in the gallery faded as Prosecutor Richard Callahan stood, smoothing the lapels of his charcoal gray suit. He was a man who thrived in the courtroom, a seasoned prosecutor who had built a career on quick convictions and airtight cases. With his crisp tie and the confident ease of someone who had done this 100 times before, he walked toward the jury box, clicking his pen as if sealing Marcus Carter's fate with every step. "Your Honor," Callahan began, his voice steady and authoritative, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Marcus Carter, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Lexus RX reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued the vehicle through downtown, where the defendant allegedly attempted to flee before being taken into custody. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." A satisfied hush settled over the room. The weight of Callahan's words was palpable. To most people in the gallery, it sounded damning. A stolen car. A police chase. Fingerprints. Open and shut. Judge Alan Whitmore peered down at Marcus, his smirk returning. Sounds pretty straightforward to me, he muttered. Callahan turned to the jury, adjusting his stance to address them directly. The defense may try to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Carter is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police? The question lingered in the air like a trap. A few members of the jury shifted in their seats. Marcus didn't react. Callahan continued, flipping through his neatly stacked case files. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The arrest was made by the book. The evidence is clear. There's no reasonable doubt here. Judge Whitmore nodded, tapping his fingers on his desk. All right, let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Lisa Thornton, the public defender assigned to Marcus. Thornton, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a history of taking on cases she never had the time or resources to win, hesitated. Marcus could feel her uncertainty. She wasn't prepared to fight this. So, he made the choice for her. He placed a hand on her arm, a silent signal. Thornton turned to look at him, searching his face, then gave a small, reluctant nod before sitting back down. Marcus took a deep breath, then rose from his chair. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Judge Whitmore blinked, his amusement flickering. You'll what? Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. I'll be defending myself. A murmur spread through the gallery. Even the bailiff looked surprised. Prosecutor Callahan, who had already started organizing his next set of papers, paused mid-motion. Then, a slow grin spread across his face. This should be interesting, Callahan said with a small chuckle. But no one was laughing when Marcus Carter took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The first crack in the case. Marcus adjusted his stance, keeping his hands in his pockets as he let the silence stretch. Not too long. Just enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Callahan raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Marcus turned to the jury, making sure to keep his voice even and controlled. Prosecutor Callahan said that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested. That's correct, right? Callahan exhaled sharply, already looking bored. That's right. And that testimony is written in his report? Of course it is. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Judge Whitmore. Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Ruiz's testimony as evidence. The judge squinted at him. On what grounds? Marcus finally pulled his hands from his pockets, gesturing toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Callahan's face. What are you talking about? Marcus took another step forward. Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. But, he let the word hang in the air, I have a feeling it won't. The gallery buzzed with murmurs. Judge Whitmore frowned and turned to Callahan. "Counselor." Callahan's jaw tightened. He cleared his throat. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor." "Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Marcus gave a small shrug. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to." A long pause. Judge Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temple. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Callahan hesitated. "Just long enough." The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Most importantly, the judge noticed. Marcus took a quiet breath. He had studied trials long enough to know that if a prosecutor truly believed in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Whitmore exhaled. "Counselor." Callahan finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The tension in the courtroom was thick, an almost tangible force pressing down on everyone in the room. Prosecutor Richard Callahan adjusted his tie, his confidence visibly shaken. He had walked into this trial expecting a quick and easy conviction. Now, he was facing a 19-year-old defendant who had just cast serious doubt on the credibility of his own witness. Judge Alan Whitmore tapped his gavel lightly, calling for order as the murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Callahan cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, trying to regain his footing. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Marcus Carter nodded, his face unreadable. "That's true," he said evenly. He took a slow step forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Marcus turned to the jury, making deliberate eye contact with each of them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that the presence of my fingerprints on the steering wheel means I stole the car. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically." He took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm, controlled. "Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" The jury exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered under their breath. Marcus didn't give them time to recover. "The car in question was parked outside a Quick Mart hours before the alleged theft," he continued. "I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity." He let the moment stretch, then in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Callahan's jaw tightened. "That's a weak comparison. A car isn't a jacket." Marcus turned to him. "Then why not prove it, Counselor? Let's talk about the forensic evidence." He faced Judge Whitmore. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" The judge blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Callahan. The prosecutor hesitated. Then, reluctantly, no. Marcus nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine. No opportunity to ask about the chain of custody or challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Callahan exhaled sharply, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. Marcus wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about another missing piece of evidence, he said, his voice steady. He turned back to Judge Whitmore. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Whitmore frowned. The owner? Marcus nodded. Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Lexus, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why. He turned to Callahan, his expression unreadable. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Callahan's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Marcus didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus held the paper up. That's from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Whitmore. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Callahan stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. But Marcus shook his head. No, I wasn't. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned. Walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. He turned back to the jury, his next words slicing through the prosecution's case like a knife. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. The room fell into stunned silence. Judge Whitmore leaned back, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Marcus turned to the jury one last time. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. He let his words settle. That's what this case is really about. The tension in the room shifted. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses, exhaled, and turned to the prosecutor. Does the prosecution have anything further? Callahan was stiff. His face flushed. His hands gripped his notes a little too tightly. No, Your Honor. The judge let out a slow breath, staring at Marcus for a long time. Then, finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that no one had expected to hear that day. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence. Then, chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Marcus didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Whitmore still gripped his gavel, looking at Marcus with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Marcus met his gaze. Then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Carter." Marcus stopped but didn't turn. Whitmore hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Marcus smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Marcus Carter stepped out of the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the cool air hitting his face like a wave of relief. The case was over. Case dismissed. He had stood in front of a judge, dismantled a seasoned prosecutor, and walked out a free man. But instead of feeling victorious, a different emotion settled in his chest, one that felt less like triumph and more like unfinished business. The moment his foot hit the last step of the courthouse, the media swarmed. "Marcus, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a top prosecutor?" Cameras flashed, microphones pushed forward. But Marcus wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This wasn't a game. He pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the noise. His focus shifted to the only person who mattered, his mother, Denise Carter, waiting at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, watching him carefully. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, like she was trying to figure out if he was really okay. Finally, she exhaled. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Marcus chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She shook her head, but the tension in her shoulders eased. "You always were the stubborn one." As they turned to leave, Marcus caught sight of someone across the street. Standing by a black sedan, Judge Alan Whitmore was watching him. But something about the judge's posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. For the first time, the man who had looked at Marcus like he was just another statistic now looked at him as something else. As someone worth remembering. The judge gave a slight nod. Marcus didn't return it. He just turned away, because he wasn't interested in whatever moment of reflection Whitmore was having. He wasn't interested in a silent apology. It was too late for that. The reality check. The ride home was quiet, except for the sound of the city passing by. Denise finally broke the silence. "You did good in there, baby." Marcus leaned his head against the window, watching the streets blur past. "Yeah. Then why don't I feel good about it?" She didn't answer right away. Marcus turned toward her. "Ma, what about all the other cases? The ones where people don't have evidence to fight back. The ones who don't have a voice in that courtroom." Denise sighed. "That's the part that keeps me up at night." Marcus thought about the people he had met in holding. Some of them weren't innocent, sure. But some of them were just like him. Arrested on weak evidence. Convicted because they couldn't afford a lawyer who cared. Their lives ruined because they weren't lucky enough to know how to fight back. Marcus clenched his fists. "I can't just let this go." Denise studied him. And what are you planning to do about it? Marcus didn't hesitate. I need to do more. I need to help people who don't have the chance to help themselves. She nodded slowly, as if she already knew what he was going to say before he even said it. Then you better start figuring out how. A different kind of courtroom. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in a small community center just outside downtown. It wasn't a courtroom, but in some ways, it felt more important. The place was packed: young black men, single mothers, ex-cons trying to get their records expunged. At the front of the room, a woman was talking about legal rights during police encounters. She wasn't a lawyer. Just a woman who had learned the system the hard way and wanted to make sure others didn't have to. Marcus watched, his mind racing. This is where it really starts, he thought. This is where change happens. A man in his late 20s, Kevin Banks, nudged him. You new here? Marcus nodded. Yeah. Kevin gave him a once-over. You ever been locked up? Marcus hesitated. I was arrested once. But I fought back in court. Got the case dismissed. Kevin's eyebrows lifted. No shit? What kind of lawyer did you have? Marcus took a slow breath. I didn't. Kevin's eyes widened. You defended yourself? Marcus nodded. For a moment, Kevin just stared at him, then shook his head with a low whistle. Man, you might be exactly what we need around here. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? Kevin motioned to the front of the room. We know our rights. But knowing ain't enough when the system is stacked against you. We need people who can actually fight back. People who can teach others how to win. The words hit Marcus hard. This wasn't just about his case. It was about all the people who never got the chance to fight like he did. That was about to change. A new purpose. As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He pulled out his phone, staring at the email he had drafted but never sent. Subject: Application for law school admission. He had thought about it before. But now, it was more than an idea. It was a necessity. His fight wasn't just about himself anymore. It was about every person who never got the chance to fight back. Marcus took a deep breath. Then, with steady hands, he hit send. The bigger picture. The justice system isn't built to protect everyone. It's designed to protect those who know how to fight back. Marcus got lucky, but how many people like him never stood a chance? This story isn't just about one dismissed case. It's about a broken system. And if Marcus Carter has his way, that system is about to change. Fire if this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. The more people who hear it, the harder it becomes to ignore. Thumbs up, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more real stories that challenge the system and demand the truth. Speech balloon and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because the next Marcus Carter might be someone you know. The day Marcus Carter received his law school acceptance letter, he felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, determination, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He wasn't just going to law school for himself. He was going for everyone who never got the chance to fight back. The courtroom had nearly taken his future away, but now, it had given him a purpose. And he wasn't about to waste it. A system that never sleeps. 2 months had passed since Marcus walked out of that courtroom a free man, but the injustice he had exposed still lingered. His case had been dismissed, but thousands of others weren't so lucky. Every day, he read about new cases, wrongful arrests, unfair sentences, innocent people caught in the machine of a system designed to break them, not protect them. And then, one day, it happened again. Another name. Another young black man arrested in the same district, under the same kind of false pretenses. Dante Miller. 20 years old. Charged with resisting arrest. Marcus didn't know him personally. But when he read the case details, it felt too familiar. A late-night stop. No real probable cause. The officer claimed Dante fit the description of a suspect, yet there was no real evidence. They were trying to bury him in the system, just like they had tried to do to Marcus. Not this time. Marcus grabbed his phone and dialed. "Kevin, we have a problem." Back to the fight. By the time Marcus arrived at the Community Legal Aid Center, Kevin Banks was already there, pacing the room, his face tight with frustration. "This is the same damn playbook," Kevin muttered, shaking his head. "They know Dante doesn't have money for a lawyer, so they're gonna pressure him into a plea deal." Marcus sat down, rubbing his temple. "Does he have a record?" Kevin shook his head. "Nothing. Clean slate. But they're still throwing everything at him, trying to make him fold." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Then we don't let him fold." Kevin stopped pacing. "You got a plan?" Marcus nodded. "I do. But it's gonna take more than just us." Flipping the script. Dante's arraignment was set for the next morning. Marcus knew exactly what the prosecution's plan was: get Dante in front of a judge, slap him with obstruction, and pressure him into pleading guilty before anyone could fight back. They weren't expecting Marcus Carter to be sitting in the gallery. The courtroom was smaller than the one Marcus had stood in months ago, but the feeling was the same. The same tension. The same weight of injustice hanging in the air. Dante sat at the defendant's table, looking as lost as Marcus had once felt. His court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man in his 50s, was barely paying attention, flipping through his notes without urgency. Then the prosecutor walked in. Mitchell Carrington. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. The same prosecutor from his own trial. The same man who had tried to bury him under false evidence. Carrington barely glanced at Marcus as he approached the bench, but Marcus saw it, the moment of recognition. The flicker of unease in his eyes. Marcus didn't break eye contact. Game on. The power of one question. Carrington started his argument just like Marcus expected. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a lawful stop, refused to comply with direct orders, and showed aggression toward the arresting officers. We request that bail be denied, given the risk of further noncompliance." Marcus clenched his fists. Lie after lie. Then Dante's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, my client maintains that he was stopped without cause. We request a review of the body cam footage to verify the details of this encounter." Marcus smirked. Now they were playing offense. The judge, a serious-looking woman in her 60s, raised an eyebrow. Does the prosecution object to showing the footage? Carrington hesitated. And that's when everything changed. Marcus leaned forward, watching as Carrington stumbled over his words. We don't have the footage readily available, Your Honor, but I assure you, the officer's statement is accurate. The courtroom shifted. The judge folded her hands. Let me get this straight. You are asking me to deny this young man bail, yet you do not have the body cam footage to support your claims? Carrington's jaw tightened. We can obtain the footage later. Denied. Silence. Dante's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Bail is set at $500. Next time, bring evidence before you waste my time. Carrington sat down, his face pale. Marcus leaned back in his seat, exhaling. That was step one. The aftermath. Outside the courthouse, Kevin clapped Marcus on the back. Damn, man. That was beautiful. Marcus shook his head. We bought time, but Dante is still facing charges. We need to get that footage before they try something else. Kevin's grin faded. You really think they'll go that far? Marcus looked back at the courthouse, at the system that had almost swallowed him whole. I know they will. The bigger war. That night, Marcus sat in his tiny apartment, staring at his law school acceptance letter. He had won his own battle. But Dante's case? That was proof that this war was far from over. Because if Marcus didn't fight for people like Dante, who would? He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts, then made a call. A deep voice answered. This is Attorney Mark Benson. Marcus took a deep breath. I need help. And I think I know how to get it. Because one dismissed case wasn't enough. He wasn't just going to law school. He was coming for the system itself. The message that matters. The justice system is designed to break people, especially those without money, without power, without a voice. But what happens when one of those people fights back? Marcus Carter won his case. Now, he's fighting for everyone else. And if he has his way, the system won't survive the fight. Fire. If this story opened your eyes, share it. The more people who see the truth, the harder it is to ignore. Thumbs up, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more real stories that challenge the system. Speech balloon and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because the next Marcus Carter might be someone you know. Marcus Carter had seen injustice up close. He had lived it. But nothing prepared him for what was coming next. Dante Miller's case wasn't just another wrongful arrest. It was the tip of a much bigger iceberg. And Marcus was about to uncover something the system never wanted the public to see. A missing video and a dangerous silence. It had been 3 days since Dante's bail hearing. 3 days since the judge forced the prosecution to admit they didn't have body cam footage ready. But Marcus knew better. The footage existed. And the fact that they were stalling? That meant it showed something they didn't want anyone to see. Kevin paced the room, frustration clear in his every move. They're playing dirty, man. They're hoping Dante takes a plea before the footage ever comes out. Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Then we find it first. Kevin stopped pacing. How? Marcus grabbed his phone. We get someone on the inside. The whistleblower. There was one person who could help them. Officer Jamie Collins. A cop who had quietly been feeding information to a few civil rights lawyers in the past. Marcus didn't trust cops. Not after what he had been through. But Jamie? Jamie was different. They met in a quiet diner on the edge of town, far from the courthouse, far from prying eyes. Jamie leaned in, her voice low. You're not wrong about the footage. But it's worse than you think. Marcus's stomach tightened. How bad? Jamie exhaled sharply. It wasn't just a wrongful stop. The officer, Sergeant Rourke, roughed Dante up before the camera was turned on. When the footage starts, Dante is already in cuffs, already on the ground. Marcus clenched his jaw. So they're hiding it because it proves excessive force. Jamie nodded. And that's not all. Rourke filed his report before reviewing the footage, claiming Dante resisted. But if that video gets out, it'll prove he lied. Marcus exchanged a glance with Kevin. They had exactly what they needed. Now, they just had to get it before the department made it disappear. The fight for evidence. Marcus wasted no time. He and Kevin filed a motion to compel the department to release the footage. The next morning, they were back in the same courtroom, facing Mitchell Carrington again. Carrington didn't look happy. Your Honor, the footage is being reviewed internally. There's no indication that it contains anything relevant to the case. Marcus stood. His voice was calm, but firm. Then why is it being withheld? The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Carrington, do you have a valid reason for withholding this footage? Carrington hesitated. The pause was too long. Marcus pressed forward. Your Honor, if this footage proves Dante Miller was aggressive, then the prosecution should have no problem releasing it. But if they're hiding it, that tells us something else entirely. Carrington exhaled sharply. The footage is incomplete. Marcus's eyes darkened. Oh. Or was it edited? Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge sighed, rubbing his forehead. Mr. Carrington, I'm ordering the immediate release of the unedited footage. If any tampering is found, we'll be discussing obstruction charges. Carrington's face turned pale. He had lost. Again. The footage that changed everything. By the time Marcus got the footage, he already knew what he was going to see. But knowing it and seeing it were two different things. Dante didn't resist. He didn't argue. He did everything right. And Sergeant Rourke still threw him against the hood of the car, punched him in the ribs, and called for backup like he was wrestling a criminal. The courtroom was silent as the footage played the next day. Dante's mother sobbed quietly in the gallery. The judge looked visibly disturbed. And Sergeant Rourke? He sat there, face blank, as if he didn't recognize himself in the video. Marcus turned to the jury. This is what happens when we trust the system without questioning it. He let the words sink in before continuing. Dante Miller wasn't just falsely arrested. He was assaulted. And if we hadn't fought to get this footage, no one would have believed him. Silence. Then the judge exhaled. The charges against Dante Miller are dismissed immediately. And Sergeant Rourke, you are hereby suspended pending investigation. For the second time in his life, Marcus had forced the system to look at itself. And this time, the whole world was watching. The fallout. That night, the video went viral. Every news station ran the footage. Social media exploded with outrage. And within 24 hours, Sergeant Rourke was fired. Marcus sat in his apartment, watching the news, but his mind was already somewhere else. Because this wasn't over. For every Dante Miller, there were hundreds more who never got their justice. And Marcus? He wasn't done fighting. The war continues. The justice system thrives on silence. It counts on people giving up, taking plea deals, believing they don't have a choice. But Marcus Carter had a choice. And he had made it. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every innocent person who had been wrongfully accused. And if the system thought it could keep getting away with it, it was dead wrong. Marcus Carter had won a battle, but he knew better than to think the war was over. Dante Miller was free, Sergeant Rourke was fired, and the world had seen the truth. But when you expose corruption, the system doesn't just back down, it fights back. And Marcus was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. The warning. It started with a phone call. Marcus was sitting in his office, reviewing new cases, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. But something told him to answer. Marcus Carter. The voice was deep, steady, too steady. A cop. Marcus's grip on his phone tightened. Who's asking? Just a friendly voice reminding you to be careful. Not everyone likes what you're doing. Marcus's jaw clenched. That a threat? The voice chuckled. Just saying, accidents happen. Maybe you should step back before one happens to you. Click. Marcus stared at his phone. He had expected backlash. But not this soon. Kevin walked in, noticing his expression. What's wrong? Marcus exhaled. They're watching us. Kevin's face darkened. Then let's make sure they know we're watching back. The setup. The next move came fast. 2 days after Dante's case was dismissed, Marcus got a call from a client, a young black man named Andre Simmons. Andre had been pulled over for a broken taillight. By the time it was over, he was in cuffs, facing a felony charge for resisting arrest. Marcus drove straight to the precinct, but the moment he walked inside, he knew something was off. The officers at the front desk didn't meet his eyes. The air was thick with something unspoken. Then a door opened, and Captain Raymond Hawthorne stepped out. Hawthorne. A cop with 3 decades on the force and a history of covering for bad officers. Marcus had seen his name in multiple complaints that never went anywhere. Hawthorne smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Carter. What a surprise. Marcus crossed his arms. Where's my client? Hawthorne stepped closer. Oh, he'll be processed soon. But while you're here, we should talk. Marcus didn't move. I'm not interested in backroom deals. Hawthorne chuckled. Oh, I don't think you understand. This isn't a deal. This is a warning. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You embarrassed my department. You got one of my officers fired. And you made us look weak. Marcus held his ground. You made yourselves look weak. I just showed people the truth. Hawthorne's smile faded. You don't get it, do you? The law isn't about truth. It's about control. And people like you. His eyes narrowed. You're getting in the way. Marcus could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just about Dante anymore. They wanted him to stop. And if he didn't, they'd make him. The retaliation. The hit came that night. Marcus was heading home when he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a light. He knew exactly what this was. He pulled over, keeping his hands on the wheel as the officer approached. The cop leaned down, smirking. License and registration. Marcus handed it over. The cop barely glanced at it before stepping back. Then, another cruiser pulled up. Then a third. His stomach twisted. They were making a show of this. Intimidation. After a long pause, the cop returned. Step out of the car. Marcus didn't move. Why? The officer smiled. Because I said so. Marcus exhaled slowly. He knew how this worked. They wanted him rattled. He didn't give them the satisfaction. Slowly, he got out. Hands on the hood. He did. Then he felt the rough grip on his wrist. The cuffs clicking shut. You're under arrest. Marcus's pulse pounded. For what? The cop grinned. Obstructing an officer. The jailhouse lesson. They kept him overnight. No phone call. No explanation. Just hours in a cold, windowless cell. When morning came, Kevin bailed him out. But as they walked out of the precinct, Marcus noticed the reporters waiting outside. And suddenly, he understood. This wasn't just about scaring him. This was about ruining him. By the time he got home, his name was already on the news. Activist lawyer arrested for interfering with police investigation. Did Marcus Carter go too far? They wanted to paint him as the problem. Turn him into the villain. But they underestimated one thing. Marcus Carter wasn't going to break. The next move. Sitting in his office that night, Marcus stared at his phone. Then, he made the call. The voice on the other end picked up instantly. You ready to take this further? Marcus exhaled. Yeah. It's time. Because if the system wanted a fight, he was going to give them one. Justice is not automatic. It is demanded, defended, and fought for. In a world where power often shields those who misuse it, standing up for what is right can feel like an uphill battle. Yet, History has shown that real change begins with those who refuse to remain silent. When injustice thrives in the shadows, exposing the truth is the most powerful tool we have. It takes courage to challenge corruption, to question authority, and to push back against a system that resists accountability. But every act of resistance, every voice that speaks out, chips away at the walls of oppression. We must remain vigilant, informed, and united in our pursuit of fairness. If we do nothing, we allow injustice to continue. But when we take a stand, whether in the courtroom, on the streets, or in everyday conversations, we remind the world that power belongs to the people, not just those in uniforms or high offices. If this message resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay engaged in the fight for truth. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Let's make our voices heard together.